So for a number of years, we've been trying to define some biomarkers for neurodegenerative disease in Langerhans cell histiocytosis. And as you are probably well aware, there are some corollaries in the clinical presentations of the two diseases, LCH and Erdheim-Chester. And of course, for LCH, pituitary hypothalamic involvement is a very prominent feature, occurring in up to 25% of patients. And the neurodegenerative problem, which occurs in 4 to 10% of patients, is a devastating lifelong problem. These pictures are paralleled by a patient with Erdheim-Chester, who obviously has pituitary and hypothalamic involvement, and was similar but not precisely the same involvement of the cerebellum. So this is a vexing problem for which understanding has really been quite delayed because of lack of material, and that was the reason we sought to find biomarkers so that we could define the presence of and the progression of this condition. And frankly, this involvement in the cerebellum, basal ganglion pons, has been quite a mystery for a long time because of the lack of biologic material to study, and various theories for the cause of it have been put forward, be it autoimmune, paraneoplastic, or other. And frankly, we don't know much about the etiology of this problem because of the lack of biology cases to look at. There are only 12 specimens that have been published, and I'll show you those results shortly. They were studied in a very limited way with the antibodies that you see listed there. And it was interesting that there was no CD1A positive histiocytic infiltration. There seemed to be a predominance of CD8 positive lymphocytes in these specimens that had neuronal and axonal degeneration and secondary myelin loss. So our question was, what's really the cause of this, and could pathologic cells that are creating the LCH lesions elsewhere in the body actually infiltrate into the brain? And this was the published results from Nicole Groys and Hans Lossmann from 2005, showing a proliferation of CD3 positive lymphocytes that were perivascular in the brain. They turned out to be CD8 positive cells. There were a few macrophage type cells staining CD68, but no histiocytes, at least by the CD1A staining in these patients. So our hypothesis was that perhaps the LCH cells could be circulating and getting into the brain and causing either the resident microglia or the pathologic LCH cells to secrete proteins which were creating specific CSF protein profiles and causing their own damage. And thankfully, because of the BRAF V600E mutation providing a good marker, we could follow the cells in the blood and look to see if they were also in the brain. So what we did was we looked at biomarkers in patients with CNS manifestations of LCH, and the point was to define pathophysiology, see if we could differentiate LCH from other tumors, and then develop strategies to predict the patients who might develop LCH neurodegenerative disease, and finally to identify optimal treatment strategies. And you can't see this very well, but just compare our groups that we were studying were LCH patients, 40 of them. We compared them with CSF, acute lymphoblastic leukemia patients, brain tumors, and patients with neurodegenerative disease of other causes, meaning multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, and some other rare diseases. And finally, as an inflammatory control, we had some patients with HLH to see if the profile of the proteins and the CSF of those patients differed from those in LCH. Our platform, we're a Luminex platform. We had 142 analyses of inflammatory and neurologic associated proteins. We did qPCR for BRAF mutated cells in the CSF and blood. We did immunostaining of brain sections for LCH cells, the BRAF mutated protein S100B and CD3. And finally, we did qPCR on some fresh brain tissue for CD207 and osteopontin. And let's see, go back. So I'm challenged to go back here. So we have a discovery set and a validation set, and through some very wonderful bioinformatics work from our group, we were able to establish a very solid profile of discovery and validation, showing that osteopontin was significantly upregulated in LCH versus acute lymphoblastic leukemia or brain tumor patients in both the discovery and the validation set, and that S100B was just the flip of that, being higher in brain tumor than in LCH. We also showed that in comparing LCH versus HLH, that the inflammatory profile of the HLH patients did not include osteopontin, which was clearly upregulated in the LCH patients and not in the HLH. And interestingly, we found that if you look at the neurodegenerative control patients, they had a lower level of osteopontin than the LCH patients. And osteopontin's been known to be a marker for multiple sclerosis for some time. So this was the heat map, and in this case, green is upregulated and red is downregulated. And this panel of proteins, including osteopontin, complement, HBAS, and a variety of other proteins, including TGF-beta and IL-8, were lower in the ALL controls than the LCH patients, and we could differentiate those two groups with a sensitivity of 72%, specificity of 75%, and overall accuracy of 75%. When we looked at brain tumor patients, it was a slightly smaller panel of proteins that clearly differentiated these two groups, again with a very good overall accuracy of 86%. And when we compared the neurodegenerative patients, just looking at osteopontin and S100B, we could predict LCH with an accuracy of 76%. So one of the things that we discovered a few years ago was that for high-risk patients, circulating BRAF mutated cells were essentially always found. And in the panels you're going to see in the following, the circles are low-risk patients. Those with green are wild type, those with V600D are red, and unknown are blue, and high-risk patients are triangles. So if we look in CSF of patients with neurodegenerative disease, we only found 2 that had BRAF circulating cells, and those were patients with tumorous masses in the spinal cord. We looked at all of the neurodegenerative patients, and you see there were a lot that were genotype of the tumor, but a majority of those that were BRAF mutated in the tumor had circulating cells, and we did find a couple of patients with just pituitary LCH that had circulating BRAF mutated cells. So these really formed a very interesting finding for us, because it suggested that some of these patients who were years off of therapy and now had developed new circulating BRAF mutated cells were the cause of the neurodegenerative condition. And in fact, when we took tissues from 2 different patients, in the top here we have a patient who's acutely affected by the neurodegenerative condition. There's a chronic neurodegenerative LCH patient here, and then there's a lymph node of an LCH patient here. We stained with 207, CD207 very prominent in the lymph node, scattered in the 2 neurodegenerative patients. The BRAF mutated protein is found in both of the neurodegenerative patients, as well as prominently in the lymph node, and osteopontin is also found in the neurodegenerative patients, and of course in the lymph node, because we've known that osteopontin is the most highly upregulated protein in the proteome of the LCH patients. And unlike the studies from Royce and Mossman, we did not find elevation of CD8 in the chronic patient. There were just a few scattered CD8 positive lymphocytes that were very prominent in the acute version of this condition. So in another patient who we isolated tissue from the pons and brainstem and cerebellum, which are highly affected by the neurodegenerative condition, versus the frontal cortex, where it's not usually affected, you see that the BRAF mutated cells accounted for up to 12% of all the cells in the brain tissue in the brain stem of this patient. The relative osteopontin expression was quite high, as it was in the pons and in the cerebellum, but no BRAF-mediated cells or osteopontin expression was found in those locations. So we have spoken previously how our theory was that LCH in the high-risk patients it occurs because of mutation of a hematopoietic stem cell that leads to committed precursors and then distribution of the pathologic cells throughout the body, liver, spleen, and bone marrow. And likewise, in neurodegeneration, we would suggest that the ERK activation and mutation of a stem cell in these patients leads to the brain disease. So this, of course, leads us to the possibility of treating neurodegenerative patients with BRAF inhibitors, and these are 4 patients who had the onset of their neurodegenerative condition with the typical findings of the cerebellum, and this is a mesiotemporal lobe, and in those patients who are very, very badly affected, this is what we often see, and another patient with typical cerebellum problems. And they range from 1 month to 2 to 4 years before they were treated with BRAF inhibitors. And after 2 months of treatment, this patient had decreased enhancement of the cerebellum. This one's cerebellar enhancement was somewhat decreased, but more importantly, the mesotemporal area was much improved, and this patient had a dramatic response where she was totally incapable of intellectual interactions. She was very ataxic, and she became much more stable after the BRAF treatment. And in this patient also a gratifying radiologic and clinical response. And this patient who had had his neurodegenerative disease for over 10 years had a very poor response, and we would say maybe had stable disease. So our conclusions are that osteopontin seems to be a reliable marker of CNS LCH involvement, and by identifying circulating and brain resident BRAF mutated cells suggests that they play a major role in the neurodegeneration. There's a lot more work yet to do, obviously. And that finally, targeted therapy for BRAF mutated cells or MAP kinase pathway could be the best option for these patients, because we know that chemo and immunotherapy is moderately successful and sometimes not successful. And I would hypothesize that this might be a good model for ECD, and we would love to collaborate with people and look at your patients with neurologic involvement and see if some of these same findings are applicable to this condition. So I'd like to thank the people. Dr. Carl Allen is responsible for leading all of our research, and our research team, especially our bioinformatics team and our genomics collaborators have been very key to our success. So I'd be glad to take your questions.
Great questions for Tim. Maybe I'll start then. So could you tell us a little bit more about osteopontin and what its role is in neurodegeneration, what your thoughts are there? Is it connected to BRAF at all, or what effect is going on there?
Well, osteopontin calls in T cells and macrophages to a site of inflammation. So I believe that that's part of the inflammatory process in any LCH lesion. And specifically what it does in neurodegeneration, we don't have a clue. And that's ongoing work. I hope will uncover what's going on. We think that there's some role for the microglia in the brain also, that they are being activated by these whatever other cytokines are present besides osteopontin. So it's a story yet to be told.
But it's not as simple as the histiocytes actually being in the brain lesion at the site of the neurodegeneration. Is that correct?
Well, they are.
They are there. Okay.
They are the most definitely. You couldn't see it from those low power pictures I showed you, but in higher power pictures, you can see the histiocytes right next to the nerves. And I think, based upon what happens in neurodegeneration in general, I believe those histiocytes are pruning some of the neuron processes and causing the neurodegeneration. It's been.
Yeah, so Nice imaging you've done with the central for the brain. Have you done high resolution imaging of the spinal cord at all levels as well in these patients?
We have two patients who had spinal cord involvement. I didn't show their pictures, but they had little quite enhancing lesions along the cord, which disappeared with the BRAF treatment, with the vemurafenib treatment.
And any ideas of what locations, what tracks may have been involved in the regions on the spinal cord being involved? Would they like around the spinal cerebellar tract, the posterior columns, or?
We don't know that.
Don't know that.
Because of, at least from my understanding of the imaging, it's a little hard to know how deep you are in the spinal cord, and of course we don't have sections to identify that.
Of course not. Okay, thanks.
Thank you for this great presentation. Did you have the opportunity to test the predictive value of osteopontin? I mean, to check all samples of children who did not have at this moment neurodegeneration? Can you predict the occurrence of?
That's a great question, which we have not investigated, and we really should, because I think that would be helpful to, as we follow these children. And in fact, I think going forward, what we would propose is a little bit more aggressive way of following the patients who are at risk for the neurodegenerative condition, and especially those who are developing the radiographic signs but not clinical signs. And we might consider doing spinal taps on these people sooner to identify these markers.
Last question.
And that was amazing. How do the cells that you see relate to the microglia that are resident? Because of course the other theory that's out there, that Geisman I guess came up with first, is that this could be yolks that have contaminated progenitor that's been taken from prenatal life, and then it's reactivating in the brain. It might still respond to BRAF inhibition. Obviously it's hard to show the traction, but when you put microglial markers, what's the geography between microglia and the cells?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer, because there's a lot of overlap between those markers. So we haven't defined that yet, Matt. I think that's something we need to drill down on it with a little finer understanding. And personally, I think one of the things we need to do is old-fashioned electron microscopy to see what some of the resident cells in the CSF or in the brain look like.
But I guess there's not 207 in the normal brain.
Not that I know.
Excellent. Okay, well, that was a great session. Thank you again, Ken, for that.